Hello everyone, this is Fionapollo. Did you miss me? No? That's fine, I don't miss me either. I am back from vacation and from my break, and now I feel ready to jump back into the swing of things with some interesting topics lined up for the entirety of August. During my break though, I went through a bit of a nostalgia binge where I was looking up some old shows on TV tropes that I used to really love, and eventually that turned into me looking through a couple of fan art tags where I stumbled upon a bunch of different renditions of, say, Dipper and Mabel from Gravity Falls, for example, where they're slightly older. And it made me think about how there's quite a bit of fascination with fictional characters growing up alongside their audience, or more specifically, it's quite a popular trend in fan circles to age up their favourite characters. And seeing this kind of springboarded into me thinking about all the different ways in which characters are aged up and for what purposes, which then subsequently begged the question, what goes into a decent concept revolving around aging up a character? Now, this is an interesting thing because by and large, cartoon characters obviously don't age, so we typically have a limited scope of what that could actually look like, unless the source material itself makes a concentrated effort to do so for us. And because of that, it ends up opening the idea to a fair bit of dialogue. Believe it or not, aging up characters is actually a hot topic of debate within art community circles. I remember some years ago there was quite the uproar in regards to the ethics of the whole thing. Several artists or even whole shows were potentially being told that their designs either weren't accurate to the setting, fanfic writers were told that they were behaving out of character or were described as looking nothing like their previous appearances, which was usually criticised, I noticed, when a single artist imparted some more explicitly queer or POC leanings into them, for example, or God forbid, someone would be accused of having some kind of ulterior motive, which also complicates things a bit. And this was especially prominent with girl characters who were aged up. There can be a wide range of reasons as to why people partake in this trend, and so I wanted to just have a look into it as a whole and offer my own 2 cents. So today, I'm going to look into the concept and culture surrounding aging up characters. We'll be looking at both canon and fandom interpretations of the idea, as well as the hows and whys surrounding it. I'll be doing my best to look at this from multiple angles, including the implications of it in both a serialized and standalone narrative in entertainment, in addition to fandom reception, interpretations, controversies, and more. If this topic piques your interest, then please consider giving your own thoughts in the comments, and maybe like and subscribe too if you're interested. I talk about animation, fandom behaviors, tropes in various media, and all that good stuff. Please note that a lot of what I discuss in my videos is purely speculative unless evidence is given to state otherwise. I'm not claiming to be an expert here, and this is a topic of debate which can have a whole myriad of valid points and opinions, so please be respectful. I also have a small announcement at the end of this video, so please stay tuned for that as well. Let's begin. So let's get this out of the way first. Aging up a character isn't exactly something I feel I need to explain the definition of, but I'm going to anyway because you know what? The longer I talk, the more money I make. Oh, the life of a creator, right? But anyway, it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's when a particular character is depicted as having grown or become older than their original appearance. This can be done for a whole range of reasons. If we look at it in the context of an official story or series that takes place over the span of multiple years, it can be narratively important to show how a character grows and matures through their journey. In coming-of-age stories in particular, we usually see this occurring as the character outgrows old notions or beliefs and gains a more rounded perspective of either themselves or the world around them. In serialized narratives, seeing the character age allows viewers to empathize with their experiences and choices further down the line. A good example of this can be seen in Fullmetal Alchemist, as we see Ed, Al, Winry, and some other characters grow up through the series, and we get to watch firsthand how their experiences in the story shape everything from their worldviews, mannerisms, and even appearances. Shows that have enough breathing room to carve out a story that progresses through multiple months or years slowly is a great way of communicating the process of not only maturing and aging in real time, but of cause and effect to viewers in a way that allows people to possibly even reflect on their own lives and the ways in which their own choices have reflected their personal path. Aging characters can in fact be a really powerful introspective tool. Yeah, anyone who says fiction doesn't affect reality, don't listen to them, because this is a prime example of that just not being the case. Alternatively, instead of the aging being an integral part of the story or something to take a powerful message from, it can sometimes also just be a one-off situation as well, and it doesn't even have to be serious, it can just be silly with no regard for consequence. This can take the form of either a what-if filler episode, there could be some kind of wacky, scientific or magical antics that ages or de-ages a character for a short time, or it can even be to do with a time machine or something. There are a whole host of ways these situations can happen, and because of that, these renditions tend to be a lot less serious than they would be in more rigid narrative narrative structures. And examples of this were everywhere in the 90s and 2000s when standalone episodic cartoons reigned supreme on television. One of my favorite examples of this that ended up having kind of a surprisingly dark twist at the end was Ed, Edd n Eddy, aka my fave Western cartoon of all time. No other cartoon has done slapstick and sound effects to the same quality since this show, and I stand by that. Speaking of, I should probably look into writing that retrospective I mentioned ages ago. It'll happen eventually, it's fine. In the episode, Take Your Ed and Shove It, the whole premise revolves around growing up. Eddie ends up having a vision of the cul-de-sac 90 years in the future, and we get to see what all the kids look like once they're elderly. There were even unused designs for the Kanker sisters, who sadly were not shown in this episode. I think if they had, the Eds would have probably all had heart attacks and the series would have stopped there and probably got cancelled, let's be honest. But regardless, the whole sequence has Eddie panicking and scrambling to regain his youth. The episode actually kind of ends on a dark note where Eddie seems like he's back in the present where they're kids, and then the episode continues to mess with you by having him wake up from a nap where the older Eds are all playing a game together, insinuating that this is their reality. And let me tell you, if that didn't give me a weird case of existential dread as a kid, I don't know what will. So this example definitely leans more into the comedic side, but sometimes the aging up trope can also be used to portray what can be interpreted as one of two paths of a character's future, one good and one bad. A really good example of a bad path into the future within a standalone episode can be found in the original Teen Titans cartoon. In the episode How Long Is Forever, Starfire is thrown into the future and is shown a world in which the Titans disband after their friendship collapses. The only character who didn't seem to experience a deterioration in regards to their sense of self in this future was Robin, who now goes by Nightwing. This episode was a fantastic example of aging up characters in a way that makes sense in regards to their actions and circumstances while not being the center focus of the series. And I also appreciated this one in particular because it was quite upfront about how sometimes people can age poorly, even good people, which you didn't often see in cartoons at this time. Not for the protagonists, at least. These are the kinds of episodes we don't really get to have anymore because of filler content being phased out due to less episodes being in a given season and a need for absolutely everything to drive the story forward. I kind of hate it, honestly. Sometimes it's okay to take a breather from the main plot. We do it almost compulsively in video games, so I don't see why it suddenly became sacrilege in TV. And because of that newfound absence of what-if episodes and the like that don't already have this kind of premise at the forefront, what ends up happening as a result is that fans will instead take it upon themselves to conceptualize their favorite characters as having grown up or matured in a particular way that appeals to them. A fairly common form of this tends to be after a series has concluded or dropped off. Many fans who still harbor a deep love for the characters and aren't quite ready to let the story end will instead create their own headcanons for what these characters may look or behave like in the future. I already mentioned Gravity Falls, but you know, with the Book of Bill coming out and renewing everyone's interest in the series, it would be pretty remiss for me not to mention that there have been a couple of fan interpretations of older Dipper and Mabel in particular, opting to follow in the footsteps of their grunkles and seeking out adventure amongst the mysterious and unexplained phenomena lurking within the series. In fact, while we're talking about kid characters actually, something that was really popular and still crops up every so often were things like college AUs. So like, what would your fave character dress like or pursue at university level? I remember seeing quite a lot of this not long ago actually with characters from Avatar: The Last Airbender, and it still shows up every once in a while. That one in particular is really interesting because technically we are shown what these characters' futures will be like thanks to Legend of Korra, but at the same time it's not like the shows where we see it happen progressively. Legend of Korra utilizes a time skip, so fans instead got the opportunity to fill in the gaps of what they think those characters were like growing up before we see them at an older age, or even in Sokka's case, before he passes away. R.I.P. Sokka, who would have loved movers. I think you and Bolin would have got along really well. But yeah, going back into continuations, this can also link heavily into how one-off concepts that are envisioned by fans can sometimes swell to such a size that it encompasses an entire alternate universe. This is especially common when a series is perhaps a little dated, say it was made in the 90s and maybe included some themes or wordings that aren't really considered acceptable or trendy anymore. Fans now have the ability to do some retconning and mold the series after their own preferences. But even in that kind of situation, something that has begun to occur is that we will have a series or show revisit its old premise and elect to give a new spin on things. I know everyone is kind of sick of IP revivals and such, and I'm with you on that. There are far too many remakes of original series and everyone is sick of them, but the reason they even started to become so popular is because a select few worked really, really well. One such example is the Netflix film Rocko's Modern Life: Static Cling. Rocko was a cartoon that aired in the 90s, and its premise hinged on the idea of it being topical of life in this time period. The series ended, by the way, with the main character Rocko's house being flung into space with him, his two friends Filbert and Heifer, and his dog Spunky inside. Therefore, with those points in mind, it was only only natural that a way to modernize this series and its characters was to have them crash back down to Earth 20 years later and have to adjust to an entirely new modern landscape. The film was especially praised for tapping into social commentary surrounding the acceptance of marginalized identities in the form of the Big Head family. In the original series, the Big Head's child was originally a son who ran away to Hollywood so as to not become a part of the family business, and instead chose to become a cartoonist, eventually managing to create a successful cartoon based on their parents. In Static Cling, this character returns as a trans woman called Rachel. A lot of the emotional pull of the film was about Rachel and her parents finally reconciling and accepting Rachel's decision to not only pursue her own career, but also to transition. Honestly, I can't give enough praise to how clever of an idea this was, considering it was very obvious in the original series that despite creating this cartoon and achieving great things, Rachel still wasn't happy, but then finally managed to achieve this after embracing her identity as a woman. This was a really fun and interesting way to put a new spin on existing characters, or at the least, give the opportunity to provide context as to how and why they behave in certain ways within a more modern environment, and how exactly these modern environments might affect them. Within entertainment and media, aging up characters can be a very interesting narrative device, but of course, nothing is ever just sunshine and roses, and we have to concede that these things can have pros and cons. So, what can be some potential pitfalls of such a trope? Well, no matter what kind of creative vision you have, and no matter how well you or someone else feels it may have been executed, in fandom or online spaces in general really, people always have a bad habit of trying to police others and get them to follow their specific rules on any given thing, and this includes what makes a good older character design / narrative. The unfortunate thing about canon versus fanon is that people will often be more inclined to heavily disagree with fanon interpretations in favour of canon, even if the fan responsible goes into detail about why they chose a specific type of character exploration, and even if it's just for fun. I'm seeing this kind of art policing, which, let's be honest, is more or less thinly veiled bullying, be especially prominent on TikTok as the new big social media, especially for kids, which in itself is concerning. But yeah, people will always feel the need to impart their unwarranted opinions onto others. This has especially become more common following 2020 now that more people than ever are chronically online and feel the need to act out this weird high school mean girl persona. I have seen so many posts with this kind of energy that it honestly has probably shaved about 20 years off my lifespan. At least Mean Girls IRL have the balls to say this stuff to your face, you know what I mean? Oh, you think that character is cute? You're so weird. You're probably a major creep. Go outside and have a childhood. Please. I'm begging you. Which brings me to my next point. Now, I think we're all familiar with the concept of cartoon crushes as a kid, and one prominent thing with exploring characters in a fan space is that people feel they have more freedom and safety to explore things they enjoyed when they were younger, especially childhood crushes guilt-free. And I need to say this, there is nothing wrong with that. People tend to feel a bit weird when looking back on old crushes in fiction, similar to how they may have crushed on someone in real life as a kid, but there needs to be the understanding that while you are older now, it's not a crime to acknowledge those feelings so long as you're mature about it. Even children feel attraction. People who think it's weird or creepy to acknowledge you had a crush on someone years later, even though you both would have been kids, are really weird themselves, and you really shouldn't pay them any mind. And also, these fictional characters are not real people. They're not going to be offended that you had a crush on them when you were 5. There is of course still the expectation to not be weird surrounding characters if the design still has them be a minor, for example, which is pretty much standard, and if anyone does still feel the need to sexualize characters despite that fact, jail. But for the most part, indulging in a fictional childhood crush, whether it be drawing fan art of them looking cute, writing a self-insert fic, or something to that effect, just be cringe and free, okay? I'm too old to care anymore so long as you're not hurting anyone. However, on that note, I think it's only fair to bring up a topic that is what causes a good amount of the more intense debate surrounding this topic: sexualization. People are freaks. This is a fact of life, and it's usually fine, healthy even in some instances. I'm asexual myself for the most part, but even I can accept the fact that different people have different needs, and despite us as a species trying to act like we're above such things, we are still mammals. But sometimes, especially when it comes to younger characters, this can bring on a lot of questionable or even concerning conversations as to why people feel the need to do it, especially given the worryingly fast rise in internet addiction when it comes to explicit content. It's important to understand that there will be sections of all manner of different internet spaces that will not have the best interests of everyone in mind, and these places can be breeding grounds for trolls who create a lot of this type of content purely for shock value just to get a rise out of people. Please be wary of where you tread, okay? Contrastingly, going back to the whole policing thing, in recent years especially, this has begun to take more of a sinister turn as the internet and, well, society in general have become a lot more socially and politically divisive. Progressivism and activism, I think, are great, and they have their own important important places in the world. But what also happens online, especially, is that there tends to be the loss of quite a lot of information in between, similar to a game of telephone, and people have begun to use activism as a way to interpret everything they see as a black and white issue. And some even tend to see these issues or circumstances where there may not necessarily be any real cause for concern. There have been several issues in the past and present with labeling specific art styles and even characters or cultures as inherently sexual. POC and LGBTQ characters especially tend to face this as a criticism, as we are more likely to view them under a European or America-centric lens, as well as a heterosexual one. In India, for example, it's common for women to wear a choli top, I hope I'm saying that right, as part of a traditional sari, but in Western cultures, we know that cut of top as a crop top more commonly, and it can be a source of intense discussion as to whether crop tops are appropriate for children of certain ages. So I don't know if I mentioned this in a previous video, that some kid on TikTok told me I had a Predator's art style because of the way I drew like hands or arms or something. I can't exactly remember what they said, but safe to say it stopped me in my tracks for a hot second, and I was really confused as to why this kid came to that conclusion, and so I never found out because I blocked them like a normal person. I'm 28, I'm not beefing with toddlers on TikTok, are you crazy? But when thinking about it, I think a good chunk of this definitely has to do with how a lot of people like influencers and former big names in the entertainment industry have been found out to have said or done reprehensible things, especially when it concerns children, and it's horrible. Unfortunately, as well, a concerning percentage of these people were also a part of the animation industry. So by proxy of seeing just how common this is, I think most people just kind of expect something to come to light about anyone these days, regardless of whether there are any signs, to the point where the slightest thing is enough to make them look at you sideways. It's actually quite sad. When we look at some canon series though, I can kind of understand where this comes from, particularly back in the day when we were still all blissfully ignorant about a lot of stuff that goes on in entertainment spaces. For example, the whole Dan Schneider controversy at Nickelodeon. There was always the acknowledgement that sometimes in shows the characters just did not act like themselves, or were caught up in weird situations, or dressed in a way that made them feel completely removed from their original state. I mean, look no further than the OG Totally Spies cartoon. That thing was a hotbed of so many things I didn't need to know about. In regards to aging up characters specifically though, you could usually chalk that up to just how this is a thing that happens as you grow up. But in fiction, that's a bit more tricky because we don't actually see the characters grow up. So we have no frame of reference as to why they're behaving strangely or how they got into these bizarre scenarios. We don't see what leads them to alter their behavior away from how we usually know them as a child or, you know, as a younger person, and as such, there ends up being a disconnect. Luckily, in the 90s and early 2000s at least, time skips and aged up characters were usually a one-off thing that had no bearing on the actual canon of the series, as we mentioned before, so while some depictions may have been odd or off-putting, we can at least pretend to not see it for the most part. So going back to some examples in actual media, often in specific stories, there will be a situation where a time skip occurs, but the character doesn't actually age at all. This can be a really good way of seeing how the characters around them are aged up to contrast their perspectives and personalities, but this can also be a bit iffy, especially when the character is placed into a relationship. A big culprit of this a few years ago was the reboot of Samurai Jack. It was shown in the series that after Aku flung Jack into the future, time lost its effect on him and he has not aged in 50 years. This in itself is not an issue if they didn't choose to give him a companion in the form of Ashi that many initially thought would be a father-daughter dynamic. So when they hooked up, it was, well, I don't want to say shocking because I think people did expect it, but many, including myself, were really holding out on it not being the case because just going purely off of appearance, behavior, and cues from the show, Ashi didn't appear to be much older than 18 at the very least. Even though Jack looks the exact same as he did in the original series, he is still a 60 to 70-year-old man at this present moment in time within the narrative. Yikes! Infantilization can also be an issue here too, because while the character may technically be older now, they still for some reason look or behave the same as they did at a younger age, despite being surrounded by older characters, purely by virtue of them still looking very young. So people don't often switch up their behaviors or acknowledge this fact, and for reasons such as the whole dynamic with Jack and Ashi, this can get real uncomfortable to witness sometimes. Also with that, I know I'm ragging on Western animation a lot here, but anime can be just as bad for these kinds of issues, sometimes worse. For example, I stumbled across a manga in my younger years called Pandora Heart, in which the main character is trapped in an alternate plane of reality and comes out the other side 10 years in the future. It's like a Alice in Wonderland kind of story. Despite Oz, the main character now being 25, he and the secondary female character for some reason have not aged a single day, yet his close friend has very visibly grown older within that time. And also it was heavily implied that Oz's friend, whose name I can't be bothered to remember, harbored some kind of infatuation or crush on him. That was a really bizarre tidbit of the manga looking back. Several several characters outside of just those two didn't age at all either, which, you know, it was technically an Alice in Wonderland inspired story, so you could excuse a couple of, like, you know, weird plot inconsistencies, but even still. And don't even get me started on anime where the character looks 12 but is actually 2,000 years old, so it's okay to sexualize them. I hate that. If the concept around it is to examine it and frame it in a way where people can understand and appreciate how weird it is, that's one thing. I'm all for shows that deconstruct these things as a way to examine or highlight certain themes, even if it may not always be the easiest thing to watch. But when it's very clearly done for sexual gratification, that's when I kind of cross the line into not being able to watch it. I just find it really gross and weird. Of course, please bear in mind this is not emblematic of all anime, don't be ridiculous, but it is a thing that exists. So yeah, just keep it in mind. Overall, I feel like I've noted a lot of negative points here, but these tend to be the more extreme cases that coincide a lot with very terminally online patterns of behavior. For the most part, aging up characters is a fun art trend. There are a lot of cool designs out there. It can be an interesting character study in things like fanfic or AMVs, and it can also just be cool to look at all the various possibilities that can be in store for a young character's future. What could they do differently? My cat's mad that I'm working. She wants to play. What could they do differently? What would this cliffhanger that the series got cancelled on lead to? It truly is boundless. There will always be people who may take these things in a questionable route, or maybe do so maliciously, but for the most part, it's important to know when to engage with these kinds of renditions, and a lot of the time, that will be never, because if you don't like something, the best thing to do is block the person posting it, report it if it is something that seems genuinely inappropriate or untoward, but otherwise, just move on with your day. Life's too short, man. Alright, I think we're done here, or at the least, I'm running out of steam. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all enjoyed today's topic. What has been your favourite example of this trope, whether it be an official cartoon example or maybe a standalone art piece or AU idea someone made? Please let me know. What are you doing? Lady Stank, what are you doing? Also, you're all probably wondering about that announcement I talked about, right? Well, a few people have asked about this throughout my time on YouTube since I started to gather a bit of a following, and it finally feels like a good time to give it a try. I'm starting a Patreon. It's only a tiny thing for now, more of a tip jar really, but I would honestly love to be able to use it as a way to give you guys exclusive access to a couple of things, including my shiny new Discord server, original video scripts, possibly Photoshop files of the artwork I create in my videos, as well as some behind the scenes work on my indie animation project, Mint and Friends. Thank you so much to everyone who has supported me throughout my time online. I genuinely appreciate you taking the time to enjoy the things I make, and you motivate me to better myself every single day. I can only hope that I manage to do that same thing for even a few of you. Stay safe everyone, and I will speak to you very soon. Bye!